interested in all the issues that they face. Before we get started, I will just say that do land acknowledgement that we here are, many of us are settlers to the lands of the Bay of Quinte region. And I wish to acknowledge that this land was home to many indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Anishinaabe people. These peoples treated the lands and waters not as something to be owned and used for profit, but as living beings with rights and needs and a very deep respect and gratitude for the land and water and the gifts they provided to them. It is my hope to learn from this worldview and to do my part as an ally to respect the land, the water, and the other life we share this area with. And so with that, I will introduce our amazing panel. I'm going to sit down now. So I'm quite excited that despite Jane's many appointments today, because she just came from another event, to have Jane and John Thompson here. Jane has been a 4-H leader for 35 years, and she's a monthly contributor to 99.3 FM, The County Grows, on agricultural topics. John, as many of you know as well, I'm sure, is president of the Prince Edward County Federation of Agriculture and a counselor previously for Sophiasburg. John and Jane, it was a very well-deserved recognition that you're both recently inducted into the Quinte Agricultural Wall of Fame. So congratulations to both of you. And it's also my pleasure to introduce Martin Stratoff. Martin completed his education at Guelph, which I also, many years before him, did. And as I think John and Jane did as well. So we're all Guelph grads up here. Different years though. And Martin is currently the executive director of the Ontario Farmland Trust. So we have quite a wealth of knowledge and experience here to help us understand the current state of farming in Ontario and the many challenges that we have in the future. So we're going to start with Jane. No rest for you. Jane, I read that you were born in Toronto. Can you just share with us your journey from Toronto to the Bay of Quinte and farming with John?
Yes, certainly. Well, my journey to the east actually started by journeying west. I went to the University of Guelph, and there I met, hoping to take English and psychology and become a teacher or a counselor. And there I met John, a farm boy in Prince Edward County. And my first visit ever to any farm was to John's home here in Prince Edward County in the northeast of the county in February of 1969, when the snow was about 6 feet, 10 feet deep on the sides of the road. And as we came off the Harshaw Road, I thought, we're getting farther and farther from civilization. You know, where is he taking me anyway? His family must have concluded that there was hope for me because we were married 2 years later in the spring of 1971. And it was on that day that my training as a farmer's wife began, because we had our wedding at noon, so they could milk the cows in the morning and get home and milk the cows at night. All very good. And I realized that to this day, we are still organizing our lives around the needs of the animals and the land and the crops. I learned soon that this principle applied 24/7 when a knock came at the door about 2 weeks after we moved back to the farm and said, the cows are on the road, get a broom, get a flashlight. You have to direct traffic until we get the cows back in the barn. I thought, yes, Mother told me there would be days like this, but anyway, it's all worked out very well. John very wisely did not suggest that we return to the farm immediately after graduation, but instead took a job as an assistant ag rep in Brant County, where we settled in Brantford and spent many weekends at the farm. When his grandfather died in 1975, we moved permanently to the farm and started our family. After the children were settled in school, I discovered a way that I could serve the agricultural community and use my training as an educator. The job posting became available to be the dairy educator. I don't know whether you remember the Dairy Princess, but this is a spin-off from the Dairy Princess. It was far more than the Dairy Princess, if I do say so. And we were trained to do presentations on farming, the farming life, technology in farming, particularly dairy farming, because I was hired by the Milk Committee of Prince Edward County to go into grades 4, 5, and 6 classes in all of the schools, which I loved. It was so much fun. And then a year or two later, I guess, the Hastings County approached me and asked me if I would do all the schools in Hastings County as well. So I have been in all the schools right up to Bancroft in the grades 4, 5, and 6 classes, and sometimes younger, sometimes older. And that was a really good education for me to work with all of the farmers in those areas to learn about the individual ways that they did their farming, a lot the same, but some different. So I'd say that's pretty much my journey from east to west, or pardon me, west to east. I'm coming back to the east now. During the intervening years, I've had many other opportunities to serve as an advocate and educator since my current position as a monthly, including my current position as a monthly contributor to the County Grows on the Grapevine, usually about the third Thursday of the month, but they change it around. So it's at noon and at night on the County Grows. A key lesson through all of this has been for me the tremendous knowledge base, the scientific knowledge base required to farm well, and the patience and grace of farmers, especially my husband, John, in sharing his knowledge with me so that I can share it with you, the public. So thank you, John, for your patience and your education. I'll leave it there. Love that.
John, so when you grew up, you were on the farm, but we know you did work elsewhere for a while before you. But when you were growing up, did you think I'll be able to farm here someday, or I'm definitely going to be farming?
Testing here. Just put that button. Okay, so it was kind of age-related kind of opinions as to where my life would lead me. As you can imagine, things do change. So in my youngest years, the farm is really what I knew. My parents, my grandfather, and that's where I was. And you just assume, well, I would probably always be a farmer. I very much liked it. I was very active outside, helping with the animals, driving tractor for the community thrashing bee when they're picking up grain sheaves back in just before our community had any combines. And I could stand on a tractor and push my foot down, stand down on the clutch and so on. So they had me doing that kind of thing when I was, I don't know, 10 years old perhaps, maybe not even. So just, that's kind of the way life continued. When I got to the high school age, at first I was still thinking that, yes, I would probably have a future on the farm, but I was getting more aware of realities and so on. I remember talking to the guidance counselor at high school, probably grade 9, and when they would interview students about what they're thinking of their future. I remember saying I was thinking of the Kemptville College 2-year program in agriculture. And this would be Mr. Perkins for locals. He suggested that I do a degree program, well, which 4 years, because you could do that and have more options in the future. And I saw the wisdom of that, so I set my sights on going to university, well, after high school, and doing crop science as my major. Is the way that ended up. Finishing university, I wasn't sure at that point. My younger brother was on the farm, didn't know what direction this might lead, whether there'd be room for me there or not, but I did know I needed to get another career started right away, and hopefully in agriculture. And I had my eye on the Ministry of Agriculture and Food, OMAF, or OMAFRA, they call it now. And I was posted to Brant County, as Jane mentioned, as assistant ag rep, where I worked with the 4-H clubs in Brant County, first of all, and then transitioned more into working more directly with farmers and farm groups. We had information meetings in the winter on various topics, and the ag rep had me do. He was big on financial management and record keeping, so on. So he had me doing a lot of that, summaries of various types of farm enterprises and where the income and expenses were, and so on. So I was working directly with farmers on that kind of thing, and it was a really good experience. So partway, a couple years into that, my dad and my brother decided to build a new barn for milking more cows to triple the herd size, basically from, well, maybe it was 15 or so, go up to about 60. New barn, new silos, freestall, that's the open space kind of barn, free roaming, milking parlor, 2 new silos. And that was somewhat state of the art for the early 70s. And I could see the potential to join there, and also the need of it, because the help was needed. My dad wasn't getting any younger. He needed more help, and my mom was still doing administration stuff, and most things were kind of in my line. And I did see financial realities that it would certainly be okay. I was working with farmers on loan applications for what they called I think they called it the Industrial Milk Expansion Program or something, when Ontario was short of milk for the processing sector. And I would be working on loan applications and approvals and so on. So certainly had a lot of experience in helping train farmers on farm accounting, bookkeeping, so on. So that all led into coming back to the farm where I really wanted to be. So that's that story, I guess.
We're able to get back to the farm. You know, it must be, it's interesting because you couldn't just choose, I don't think, to become a farmer if you didn't have any sort of family or land to start with. You know, it's very difficult. So Martin, who's from the Ontario Farmland Trust, we have heard that Ontario is losing 320 acres of farmland per day. Can you tell us a little about the Ontario Farmland Trust and what you hope to achieve when we hear numbers like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lori. So when we hear about 320 acres lost per day, and we have 11.8 million acres of farmland in this province today, at that rate, we would be out of today's farmland in 100 years. I don't imagine that that's the situation that we're going to find ourselves in, but it's a startling number nonetheless to hear that. And so the mission of the Ontario Farmland Trust is to protect and preserve Ontario's farmland. And when we talk about farmland, we do recognize that, of course, there's the agricultural features of farmland, that is the food producing landscapes, but our natural environment also plays a very significant contributing factor to making sure that we have healthy environments to produce healthy food for our communities. So a part of the work that we do is protecting and preserving through conservation easement agreements and other forms of protection to make sure that our farmland that is available today is also available for future generations. So future generations have the food producing landscapes that they need to be able to sustain themselves. So thinking about you know, trying to make sure that this is a finite resource that's available for future farmers, like any finite resource, as the quantity is depleted, the cost is also going to increase because there's less and less of it and it's becoming more scarce. So some of the goals that we have is, one, let's reduce that number on how much farmland we're losing every single day, and make sure that it is not only available for future generations, but it's financially accessible for people to be able to get into farming as well. So there's a lot to unpack between what we do there, but it's a critical point in time, I think, right now, because we are facing a housing crisis, an affordability housing crisis. People definitely, absolutely need a place to live, but people also need to be able to be fed. And the approaches that we're taking to developing our communities right now is basically putting farmland at odds with housing. And there's other ways that we're able to engage in community development that does both. And so a lot of the work that we do at the Farmland Trust is not just about on the ground farmland protection, but it's also about engaging community members and educating them on why farmland is so important. What happens when, first, here's a personal story. Peaches are one of my favorite foods. I couldn't imagine a future where I can't get an Ontario peach, but that could be a reality. And that's a hard thing to think about when we think about the future generations not being able to have some of the over 200 commodities of food that we're able to produce here in this province, which is very unique compared to most other parts of the world. And so when we can educate people on that, we're inspiring them to take action in their local communities to be able to rally behind farmland protection as well. So that's a really other critical part of what we do. And policy plays such a critical role in that protection. So we engage quite frequently to try to have our policymakers recognize what we need in a policy landscape in order to make sure that this resource is protected, not only for today, but for future generations.
Yeah, it's so important that we have arable land. I don't know how many of you were at limits to growth when we had the limits to growth discussion. It was brought to my attention that the first time they ran the model, the limits to growth and what caused the population crash of humans on Earth was pollution. So they said, okay, well, let's not pollute so much and we'll run the model again. And we crashed because we ran out of arable land. And so for us to take what is really a precious commodity and resource and then just spend it wildly to make, in some cases, very large houses for two people to live on is just quite wrong. And the model showed that. So John, I just think because you have farmed for so many years from the time you were a child, 10 years old, working on the tractor, you know, with your grandfather till today. I have a kind of a huge question for you, but how has farming changed over the years? Just kind of, I know you increased your stock size and for dairy cattle, but what changes have you seen over the years and what things did you need to do to kind of make the farm work going forward?
Yeah, that is a big question. I didn't actually see what my grandfather was doing back when he started in 1926, obviously, but it was horses for him. I don't know that he got into tractors very much at all. My dad got started that. And he really liked horses. He liked making maple syrup. They started that early on. One of the things that they continued with. And of course, horses gave away to tractors. At that time, feeding horses took, I don't know how much of the land, and about it, how many workhorses there were in the province and how many acres of each farm were taken up by just growing the hay and the grazing land for the horses. So that as that changed to tractors, then more land was going into actual food production. So that was a big, that was a change. Mechanization changed. I did mention my first memories of the thrashing the grain was the binders and the sheaves of grain and the men throwing them on the wagons and taking them to the thrashing machine. And it was one farmer in the community had a thrashing machine, and went around to each of the farms, and everybody helped everybody else when they got to their farm, throwing on the sheaves. And the farm wives had a big dinner at noon. People didn't farm right through. They didn't work on fields through noon. They stopped had a big dinner, apple pie, the whole bit. So I always remember that. So it was only just a few years of memory on that, and the small combine started. They were pulled behind tractors, and everything has just gotten bigger since then. So the self-propelled combines and have gotten bigger. Tractors have had cabs for quite a few years now. They were open top when I started, and that seemed okay. That's all we knew. But it was sometimes hot, sometimes dusty, sometimes cold. You had to think of what layers you would take with you. Sometimes you got rained on. So the whole mechanization thing had really changed over the years. We needed to specialize the farm more. Get in, instead of, small number of dairy cows, small amount of beef, half dozen pigs, a couple hundred laying hens, maple syrup, and a little bit of canning crops, just a bit of everything. So we had to specialize to make that work better. One of the key things that evolved over the years, I'd say, was administration, where we really had to put more emphasis on proper records, projections, and so on. I was early on starting in computers and spreadsheets, and I really enjoyed it, the way you could actually make projections and update them each month to the end of the year and see where you're going financially, just to keep things on track. And usually by doing that, I found out, oh, it's not quite as bad as I thought it might be. So I think that kind of education and so on has been really an increase and helpful over the years.
It's kind of interesting to me to think that your grandfather started and there were horses and hay, and then you're using computers and spreadsheets. I can only think, what would he have thought of about it? And I didn't really think of the fact that when you're using horses or oxen, you're using a part of your farm just to keep your production going. Very interesting. Jane, you have, I mean, I'm sure you do, but do you have some insight as to how farming families have changed over the years? Have they, really changed, or they maybe it's always the same? But I know, and what were some of the obstacles that you guys had to face?
Well, that's a big question too. Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, the success of the very first farm family that I knew, the Thompson family, came from their cooperation, communication, and the passion for the work of their lives. And these qualities were also evident in their relationships with the rural community. When John was very young, maybe 4 or 5 years old, with 2 young siblings, his father had a brain tumor. And there were 5 carloads of men went from the neighborhood to Toronto to give blood so that his father could have the required surgery. And when his father came out of the surgery, his sight was affected. He could still drive by himself. He never drove again with the family in the car. His mother did all the driving after that. And he would drive in the fields on the tractors. And his sight did get worse over the years. But she was so thoughtful. She would do things like paint yellow fluorescent strips around the handles of his garden tools, so if he set them down, he could find them. But that's just one little example of the kind of relationship that went on in a farm family. Everybody had to pull together, and I'm sure you know that. But it was a learning experience for me, coming from the city, from Toronto. I've seen much the same kind of thing in young farm families today. I recently interviewed a young farm family where the brother I was interviewing had 4 brothers who all wanted a farm. How do you provide a farm for all 5 brothers? How do you develop a succession plan for all 5 brothers? And this brother said it was due to the sacrifice and determination of my parents that all 5 of us are now farming. They've just recently opened a beautiful new dairy barn in the south of the county, and 3 robotic milking stalls in it, high tech, and they all have their own niche. he loves the crops, the one I interviewed. His brother is a mechanic, another brother does the accounting. I'm not sure about the other two, but I'm sure they have individual roles too. So that's another aspect of a farm family. Everybody has a role to play, even if it's working off the farm, which I would say for farm families today is far more necessary than it used to be because of the cost of land and equipment to farm, even to do repairs. We were getting a radiator repaired out of an older tractor that we bought, $1,600 just to repair this radiator. And that's trying to keep an old tractor going, not even buying a new one. That's just one example. So, so in many ways, farm families have not changed. I would say that 97% of the farms in Canada are family farms, which is quite amazing. And I'll be talking in a few minutes about the quota system. And a lot of it has to do, I think, with the quota system, certainly in the dairy, egg, and poultry sectors, that they're still able to maintain small family farms with a reliable income. If there's anything else I can. No, I think that's pretty much it. It's very good.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's an interesting mixture because really it's a business in a way. And everybody in the family is kind of an employee, right from the smallest to the oldest. You kind of need to pull together and, but yeah, I just think it's kind of interesting how sometimes you can't mix business with family, but in farming families, you would have to in a way. Because that is how you're all making your living. So John, as Greens, we are always worried about sustainability. And I know when you talked to us at our last speaker series, I was kind of struck by how you had made changes to your farm to make it more sustainable and how really you bear the costs of that. And anyway, I was just thinking, do you think governments can do more to support farmers as they try to farm more sustainably?
Yes, there certainly are a number of beneficial management practices out there and some grant programs that will support some cost on those things with some assistance in the cost of putting down cover crops, basically after winter wheat crop, because there's still lots of growing season left. And cover crops are really beneficial to in various ways. Stopping erosion, for one thing, opening up the soil a bit so it absorb water better, adding organic matter to the soil to improve the soil health, and putting carbon down into the soil. So I think they could double down more on those things. There's, like I said, there are some grants available on those things. The application process, I think, could be a little simpler. And a lot of these programs have a budget, and they just, if your application isn't in on time, well, wait for the next intake, that kind of thing. So I just think there's room for improvement there. Reduced tillage, it could be more support for that too. That hasn't really had much support, but I think practices are well enough known, and there could be some more assistance on it. Another thing that comes to mind is, first of all, do no harm, because they do that sometimes. One example of that would be the carbon tax on heating fuel for chicken barns, greenhouses, and so on. That's something that really can't be passed on to the consumers very well. It certainly hasn't been yet, but it's quite inconsistent because the governments have exempted, the federal government exempted farm diesel fuel, for example, from the carbon tax because there's really no alternative. And carbon tax is supposed to push people towards alternatives. And farmers in general do support this concept of carbon tax. But what about what we need to heat our chicken barns and so on, and big barns for young pigs and things like that? The House of Commons has passed private members bill to do that, exactly that. It goes to the Senate's amended it, sent it back to the the Commons 3 times now. And it may eventually be dying on the order paper as it takes its turn in private members bill. But it's a different logic, they're exempted from farm machinery fuel because there's no alternative, but they don't for the heating of farm buildings. And how is that supposed to give us incentive to change to some other kind when there is no other kind? So that's the case of just doing harm, and it harms farm income if you're in that kind of a line of work. It's not good enough for the Minister of Environment to say, well, that's not much average over all the farms. Well, we're not talking about all the farms, we're talking about certain specialties. And that's something that's harmful now and may at some point be passed on to the consumers, at least in part.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned to me, like, for the chicken barn, that the temperature required, you couldn't even begin to use a heat pump to generate the types of temperatures that the chickens need. Is that correct?
That's correct, because we need to start the little chicks off in a 90-degree barn, 90 to 92. And then as they grow, age, that can come down about a degree per day or 5 degrees a week type of thing, just pretty much 1 degree a day. They'll get down to around 70 when they're more getting closer to market, they're feathered up and so on. But as newborn chicks, they're really a cold-blooded animal, so they have to have as much heat as the body needs. They're not helping themselves yet, they can't regulate, but that does come. So in the winter, it does take quite a bit of heat, but you also have to use brooding heat in the summer as well. And you don't get 90 degree heat out of a heat pump. And of course, there can be some dust issues and so on too that just make the alternatives not possible.
Yes, and I think it's interesting, we were kind of talking and joking about it earlier, but that, there's so much specialized knowledge that's needed in farming, and the people that are making decisions that are impacting farming often don't have that knowledge. And I think I suggested maybe we needed more farmers to be running in politics. And John and Jane reminded me they don't have time because they're so busy. It's quite interesting. I'm just amazed at the amount of knowledge that's required to run successfully any type of farm. Jane, as we face a changing climate, do you feel that farmers are in a position to be leaders in addressing the challenges of climate change, ecosystem loss, and biodiversity loss?
There's another big question.
I know.
Yes, well, I think history will judge whether farmers have been leaders in this area, but I'll just review some of the beneficial practices that John has touched on already, and what farmers are doing to try to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which of course is the underlying cause of climate change. And I would mention, just to start off with, a farmer who is a real leader in one of these areas, which is plastics. And the amount of plastic that we have in our world. This fellow's name is Lynn Levitt. Some of you probably know Lynn, and Lynn has developed a compactor for the white bale wrap that you see on the long rolls of bales out in the countryside. So he gathers it together and compacts it and sends it away to have further processing done on it. And there's some science going on now that can be converted to biofuel. So as he says, it's a cycle. It will be a closed circle. We get the plastic from the bale wraps, compact it, turn it to biofuel. The biofuel can go back in the tractor or one of the farm vehicles. So hopefully that will be more widespread in the future. But that's one example of a farmer leading the way with his creativity. So looking at the three major greenhouse gases, carbon, methane, and nitrous oxide. First of all, for carbon, farming is involved with the carbon cycle, of course, and greenhouse gas emissions are being reduced. First of all, I should have mentioned, agriculture is responsible for only 10% of the greenhouse gas emissions in total. And so carbon is by far the largest contributor to that 10%. But the question becomes, can we store or sequester carbon in the soil to equal the carbon emitted to the air by our farming practices and activities? So carbon sequestration is certainly aided by crop rotation, cover crops, reduced tillage, including no-till planting with special equipment for that purpose. And some of the grants that John was talking about are available for some of that special equipment. So that's a bonus. Typical crop rotation in southern Ontario would be corn, soybeans, and winter wheat. Each of these crops returns carbon to the soil in both the roots and stalks left on the ground as crop residue after harvest in a minimum no-till or no-till scenario. The rotation is also beneficial in reducing insect and weed pressure on yield. Rotation also provides a window of time after an early harvest crop such as winter wheat, where cover crops such as oats, clover, rye, or radish, and many, many others can be planted. So as John said, these serve to put the carbon back into the ground and reduce the erosion of precious topsoil and weed growth so that there are fewer weed seeds being deposited into the weed seed bank for future years. Further gains in carbon storage can be gained by growing perennial forages such as alfalfa. And these are used to feed cattle in a rotation with grain crops. So you would have possibly 3 or 4 years of your forage crop in pasture and then switch to a rotation of corn, beans, and wheat for the next 3 years. Thus, livestock do play an important part in the carbon cycle. Cows primarily, but and pasturing is also important in that cycle. For the other two gases, first, methane comes primarily from cows, and one of the things that's been invented recently and is just coming on the market now is an inhibitor that can be added to the cattle feed to inhibit some of this methane from being returned to the atmosphere. So that may become more widespread in the future. And another is for the nitrous oxide. An inhibitor is now coming on the market that can be added to the fertilizer so that if the fertilizer is not worked in, or there's not a rain right away that would work it in, it won't be oxidized and returned as nitrous oxide to the air, a very potent, again, greenhouse gas. So, but it doesn't last all that long in the atmosphere. So there are things being done, certainly, to improve carbon, or pardon me, decrease carbon emissions, and also methane and nitrous oxide.
Very cool. I didn't know about the nitrous oxide inhibitor, or I had heard something about methane inhibitors to reduce the burping of cows.
I did think of one other thing. It's the R4 protocol, which is the right amount, the right fertilizer at the right time in the right place. And the farm center here in the county is using precision agriculture to use gamma radiation, I think, to map the nutrients. So you can get a grid map for a particular field, and they have equipment that can change the fertilizer, amount of fertilizer being applied as they go through a field according to this grid map. So it will reduce the total fertilizer. It's not just same for the whole field, but it will reduce the total fertilizer that you're adding. And that's another very up and coming.
That's amazing.
It is. But
We don't do that for our yards.
yes,
I often, sometimes, they say, well, farming is not always so good for the environment. In some ways, they use fertilizer or whatever. And these are the same people. You go to their house, they have this turf lawn, it's growing nothing, and they are applying fertilizer and pesticides. And I'm like, but wait, that's not even growing us food. And we need to kind of not always just say it's 10% of emissions. I mean, it's not insignificant, but it's also not the major emissions.
transportation.
Yeah,
Fossil fuels.
exactly. I agree. I've learned that.
If you're doing no-till farming, you don't have to run your tractor over the fields as many times either.
Oh,
That's a big one.
yeah. Martin, it's clear that governments play a key role in ensuring the success of a local agri-food system. Do you think provincial and federal governments are doing enough to support our farmers and our local food supply?
That's such an easy question. Thank you, Rory. Well, I mean, I think all of us would probably always say that governments can do more. And I think that one thing that it is important to recognize is what they are doing so far. There is significant investment in the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership Program, billions of dollars from the federal and provincial governments that are going into investments to support both research and development, which is very critical to hear a lot of the types of new initiatives that are coming out to help make agriculture more sustainable, but also aid in farmers' ability to be able to adopt these types of practices. So it's heading in the right direction in terms of getting some support in that way and making sure that we have the research and the data to back up the decision-making that needs to be done in order to say what practices should be adopted. But of course, when we think also from the support level for the local farmers, one thing that we need to recognize is that, and I'm sure everyone has seen this in the newspaper, the profits at the grocery stores continue to get higher and higher. And yet the amount of money that farmers get from that profit has remained stagnant. And so the profit share between food sales isn't making its way back to the farmer, which is making it ever increasingly difficult to make sure that farming remains viable. And when we're talking about the rising price of farmlands and the mechanization that we heard John mention as well, and a lot of the additional costs that it takes to now adopt some of these new types of sustainable agricultural practices, it is increasingly difficult to justify that from a business perspective. So we have to make sure that it's viable in that way, as well as sustainable in our other areas as well. I think the other piece is that both federal and provincial governments can certainly work a little bit closer together in a lot of different ways, but we have one way in particular. When we think about our land use planning system, we have a horizon for planning for housing to take us past 2050. We don't have any type of planning horizon for our food system. And I think that's a scary thought when we're hearing about the numbers of farmland loss, and we know that there's significant pressures on municipalities right now to make sure that housing is being developed. But the same type of pressure or attention isn't being put on the fact that our agri-food sector needs to remain viable into the future as well. And when we think about the Farmers Wanted report that was done by RBC and the University of Guelph, it recognized that 40% of farmers are set to retire in the next 10 years. 66% of farmers don't have a succession plan in place. So there's certainly a lot that can be done to help support and facilitate succession planning on farms and make sure that there's a next generation of farmers who are trained in these sustainable agricultural practices to be able to take on the farming and maintain our local food system. At the Farmland Trust, we'll say, if we don't have farmers, we don't have farmland. So we're not really doing our job if we're able to protect all of this land, but then there's nobody available to farm it. So we have to make sure that those types of supports are there, that there's affordable pathways for people to get into agriculture, and absolutely municipalities at all levels, federal, provincial, and I think municipal as well, all have a role to play to make sure that that is supported. And that comes to land access programs that I know we've, at the Farmland Trust, have been looking at the development of land access programs. We've looked to the United States that have very robust programs through their land trusts to be able to facilitate those types of pathways. And in our research, we've realized that agricultural organizations have been calling on this need for a land access program for at least 20 years now, at least. I'm sure it goes back even farther than that. But that's as far back as the reports that I was beginning to read before you start to see the same messages going over and over again. And you're thinking, why hasn't anybody listened and done something about this? So we need to make sure that our federal and provincial governments are listening to these types of issues and concerns. And the last thing I'll say as well is, when we hear about a lot of the new regulations that farmers have to now abide by, which I think, you want to talk about continuous learning, become a farmer. You can never stop learning when you become a farmer. And yet there's not always a level playing field when it comes to where we're getting food from other countries from. And so when we're thinking about prices of the tax for our greenhouses to heat our greenhouses, but the same types of taxes aren't being applied to countries in other locations in order to, that we end up importing that food from, and it's going to be a lot cheaper to produce that food. It's not a level playing field, and then we're going to be buying food that contributes to the same problem that we're trying to get our farmers to deal with. And then we've undermined their ability to actually do that. So thinking about some of those complex global agri-food networks that impact the local farmer needs to be really taken into consideration when we work on those types of changing policies. I really think that's actually, I listed a few things, that's a drop in the bucket for what I think governments could also be doing, but yeah, well, I'll wrap that up there. Thanks, Lori.
Yeah, there's so much that could be done. I just was reminded by Dawn of the time. So I'm going to, John, maybe not do question number 9, but go right to question number 11 about the financials. I had a patient come into my hospital or my stress lab, and he was a farmer, and he said, the problem with farming is that I buy everything at retail and sell it all at wholesale. And I thought that was a very I said, can I steal that? And he said, yes. So I did. But it seems that your costs are going up all the time and the prices are not necessarily following. So is there some thoughts you have about that?
Yes, that's a good question. I wish there was a good answer, but cost of land is so high and has been rising so much that that's definitely a barrier. Equipment, we could say the same thing. Cost of equipment very high. Cost of parts, those can inflate very, very quickly. And at least with equipment, there are some choices. So it's used equipment, but with land, there aren't choices other than can you afford to buy it or rent it, or how do you get the land? I was just looking at some history, which was pointing out about the settlements here being basically in Ontario, 100-acre parcels, as much as possible, some woodlot for so they could heat their homes for the winter, that kind of thing. And that was just the original survey, thinking 100 acres was good for farmland, for farm family, which of course that's not necessarily the case anymore. If you're specialized, you could be on a very small acres, market garden kind of thing, but otherwise commodity type things, livestock, so on, much bigger. So I think there's maybe 2 trends of the main one being bigger farms, but maybe small parcels increasing as well. So those are certainly financial challenges. So good record keeping, good projections are something that help to manage those things. But I guess you think back to England, where there was large landowners and tenant farmers, and with the pension funds and investment funds and so on buying land, are we headed back to that? Big landowners and tenant farmers? Well, we certainly hope not.
That would be awful, actually. I hope we continue to have 97% family-owned farms. That certainly makes me feel more comfortable. Jane, I was wondering, like you mentioned and talked about it a little bit before, if you could comment on Canada's marketing boards and where do you prefer to see the kind of subsidies that are available in the US? And I think Martin also kind of touched on that. But I think many of us are pretty much unaware of the role of house subsidies and quotas and that sort of thing work. Yeah, small question.
Again, right. Yes. Well, our marketing board system is a national agricultural policy framework which controls the supply of dairy, chicken, and eggs through production and import quotas and price mechanisms. You may be, some of you, quite familiar with it, but some people not. So the first supply management system was first authorized in 1966 with the Canadian Dairy Commission, and then that was for the dairy products, in 1972 for the Farm Product Marketing Act. And it's been a blessing, really, and I think, as I said, has been largely responsible for smaller farms being able to stay in business. There's quite a history to the development of the marketing boards in Canada, and maybe I'll just briefly review that because it's really good to look back at the lessons of history and see what worked in the past and why we have this system and have had it for the past 50 years. And it's provided stable economies for farmers and a stable supply, a reliable supply of safe dairy, chicken, and egg products in Canada. So I'll go back, I think, to the Second World War, just to review quickly the history of what happened here when rationing and price controls were brought in during the war to make sure that there was enough food. So people became accustomed to that. And after the war then, were comfortable having some of that continue. But the problem was there was no control of production, and overproduction did become a problem again. So prices dropped, and in the intervening decade after the war, there was kind of a mass exodus as the smaller farmers could not survive, and the larger ones, well, some grew larger, and they're the ones that survived. And there was some stabilization subsidies in the US. I think it was about 1958. I think it was $6.2 billion paid in stabilization programs to US farmers to try to keep them in business. In Canada, it was about 31 million, I think, to dairy farmers during that period. And the government said, we can't afford this. We've got to find a better way, not just for the farmers, but for the payouts to the government, from the government, excuse me. So the marketing boards were created, and I'm really proud of our Canadian farmers and the processors who worked together to make this system work. It took a lot of cooperation because there was provincial challenges, I'll put it, to the transfer of dairy products, chicken and eggs from one province to another. They were protecting their own farmers. And do any of you remember the chicken and egg wars? I think in the early 60s, where Quebec had tariffs on imports, even from other provinces, and they were confiscating chicken and eggs at the border coming into Quebec and destroying them because they wanted their farmers to have the market for themselves. Anyway, that was one of the factors that caused provinces to work together to create these nationwide marketing boards, although they're not truly controlled nationwide. There are provincial blocks. There's an eastern block, which is Ontario, Quebec, and the 3 maritime provinces, and a western block, and then BC, I believe, is how it works. And they, each year, for instance, for the Canadian Dairy Commission, they set the national market quota for milk, how many kilograms they expect. So they have a formula that looks at the cost of production for farmers and what they think the market will bear, and that's the price. And a marketing board, by definition, means that everybody selling that, every farmer producing and selling that product has to accept the regulations of the marketing board. There were cooperatives previously to that, but they didn't work as well because not everybody was a part of them. So with the marketing board, everybody in that commodity needs to be a part of it. Some people say that it may keep our prices up too high, but if you look at the price of dairy products certainly did go up during COVID, about 9% at one point, I think. But at the same time, in the UK, where there is not a marketing board for dairy products, at one point they went up 47%. And this is the kind of fluctuations in prices that we were experiencing before the market boards were established. So they, I would say, have been a great benefit to farmers in those commodities.
Oh, great. No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Lori, can I just add one thing that I think is really important to this? Because when you see news stories from the US about the thousands of liters of milk that get dumped because it's cheaper to dump the milk than it is to try to ship it because they're not getting enough money for it. Let's go back to thinking about how many cows had to burp to make that milk. And here we are thinking about trying to ensure that, not only is it about creating stable prices for farmers, but think about the environmental impact for milk that just got dumped. That is a waste. And the supply management system helps prevent that kind of waste from happening. So it does have other types of benefits that just when we hear sometimes economists that are criticizing our supply management system, I don't think they're taking everything into account.
I would make one more comment in that line, that it also provides a stable supply of goods for consumers. And for instance, during the floods in British Columbia, when many dairy farms and chicken farms were just flooded right out, they still had a steady supply of eggs and dairy products coming in from the other parts of the country. And about the UK, one farmer was interviewed there and he said, we've lost our control of the narrative. And if you're concerned about your country's food sovereignty and stability, you better pay attention to that issue of marketing.
Very good information. Thank you, guys. Martin, you touched on this already, that recent stats indicate 40% of farmers are planning to retire within the next decade. 66% of those lack a succession plan. And of course, it's also been touched on by all of us, all of you up here, that it's the cost of farmland is extremely prohibitive for young people who want to get into farming. What steps do you believe should be taken to address these challenges, especially with the prohibitive cost of farmland right now?
Yeah, so this one it's very complex because I think what we have to also recognize is that there are challenges with existing farmers to be able to buy more land to expand their operations, to be able to maintain the economic viability that they need to continue their operation. And so as farms need to get larger and larger to maintain their business viability, what 23-year-old who wants to buy a farm has enough money to buy now a 200-acre plus farm? That's not a stepping stone for somebody to be able to get into agriculture. And so I really appreciated John's comment earlier about also recognizing that small farms play a significant role in our agri-food sector as well. And we can have viable small farms. And so we think we need to rethink this model around, farms shouldn't be smaller than 100 acres. Now, I think that those rules were put in place to make sure that farm families did have enough land to maintain their economic viability. But at the same time, we're now at a point where it's prohibiting younger farmers to be able to gain access to land. There's a lot of opportunities for us, I think, to try to curb land speculation as well. That is really driving up the price of farmland. I don't have specific stats in Prince Edward County, but I have seen the signs for development and I have heard the stories, and I have no doubt that a main contributing factor is again that depletion of farmland. But now farmers or young people who want to get into agriculture, who might not be coming from a farm family, that there's a succession pathway for them, they're up against developer prices. People with very deep pockets who are very happy to buy land and can sit on it for 10, 20, even 30 years until there's a pro-development council in place saying, yep, okay, let's change that land use designation from agriculture to residential or commercial or industrial. And so we need to shift this paradigm of our land use planning system that often just looks at agricultural land as a placeholder for future development. I didn't mention this earlier, but I grew up on a dairy farm in Arnprior, just on the edge of the Canadian Shield. So we farmed a lot of rocks in my childhood. I spent many of my summers picking rocks out of the fields. And I share that story so people understand that agricultural land is, in a sense, developed for agriculture. It has taken generations upon generations, and even before settler generations arrived, indigenous communities who have cared and stewarded for these lands so that they are able to produce food for us. This isn't just vacant land. This is land that needs to be protected. And if we're able to protect it and make sure that land speculators can't swoop in with their, 0.0000 after some numbers that, isn't really affordable from a farming perspective, that's going to help prevent that escalating price. I think that also might only be a drop in the bucket, though. I think we also need to recognize that we need to be supportive of cooperatives as well. Jane, you had mentioned how critical the family structure is to farming. Well, the family structure is also changing. It is not what it was when my parents were growing up and they were farming. There was, of my dad's generation, there were 6 of them that were able to help out on the farm. Luckily for my grandparents, that was a lot of free labor for them. They don't have that access to free labor anymore, and there's less and less families are having less and less kids. But there's other ways for people to come together in a family type unit who have an interest in getting into agriculture together. But it's complex. The way that we have our land tenure system in place to be able to share in those, the resources aren't as well established for people to join a collective and go to a bank and say, can we get a loan for this? They'd much rather see a history of being able to manage finances in agriculture to be able to sign off on a loan. And so we need some innovative programs to be able to offer affordable funding as well. I hate the day if we ever got back to the interest rates of the 80s. Who would be able to not only afford today's farmland prices, but then be able to afford basically putting that on their credit card at 20% interest rate? We wouldn't be able to maintain our agricultural system that way. So we have to look at it in a very, multi and complex different facets of saying, how can we get people onto the land? And we have no research that is actually saying we have X number of people in this province or this country who are trying to get into agriculture but can't. We know the numbers are there. We know the people are there because we hear the stories and the surveys are done, but we don't really have a hard number on it. And yet, when we hear about the number of farmers that are going to retire within the next 10 years, the first thing I heard the government say was, well, we'll bring in immigrants to be able to farm. Now, and that's not anything against immigration. What it is saying, though, is that there are people in this country who are trying to get into agriculture, and we have barriers that is preventing them from doing that. And our first thought is saying, well, we should look across, on the other side of our borders to find people who would be willing to farm. People are willing to farm in this province. They want to farm in this province. We have to be able to make it possible for them to farm in this province.
Exactly. Yeah, we have a line up here. We just need to make sure they can get what they need so they can start. We have quite a few more questions, but we don't have really any more time. I'll just kind of leave it with John and Jane. Do you guys see any reasons for optimism when you look at the future of farming in Ontario?
Can I take maybe 1 minute to jump back on that previous question? Yeah. changes to make the farm work. I kind of stopped at the end of the last century, and at which time dairy farming work started out very well, but for various reasons, it was getting to be not so good. So, we were able to buy out my brother and got some hired help in, and went really well for a short number of years, maybe 3 years or so. But our son was going away to university, so he wouldn't be there for pitching in if I needed somebody to help milk or whatever, and he really didn't want a dairy farm. So we decided to change. We sold the dairy cattle, not really knowing what to do next. And then his interest was, yes, but we should be able to farm in some way, and he would like to. So that's why we swung into broiler chickens in 2003, opened up a new barn and started a new chapter. We just had to pivot away from what we were doing. And we looked after that pretty well ourselves for 10 years before he could join us full time. Otherwise, he was just available some part-time. But that was 2003, 2011, got approached by Tony Ambler, who I met at University of Guelph, and his family owns Swish Canada, the cleaning company, cleaning products, and he was head of farm, and he was interested in chickens. He was growing chickens, but his real interest was start a new brand, Yorkshire Valley Organic, and we got signed into that in 2011 as one of the first growers. And we've been with them since then. And that was a move out of cattle. So from a land and environmental point of view, we had to make some changes as well. When you have cattle, you have a lot of forages. You're growing hay, silage crops for cattle, and there's nothing better than forages for putting carbon in your soil, preserving soil health, the whole thing. But moving to chickens, you don't need that. So if you're really talking about building soils, you're talking about cattle. So moving into a grain-eating animal, we just did the best as we could, which is working quite well. The solid crop rotation, cover crops after wheat, chicken manure back, wheat straws is baled, used to bed the chicken barn. Litter is spread on the fields after the wheat for part of the fertilizer for the corn. Minimum tillage, if any tillage at all. Actually, we do a light tillage after the wheat or the manure is spread. After that, it's no tillage planting. So we're checking all the boxes to keep carbon in the soil, but we don't have the advantage of growing feed for cattle right now. And I think it's working fine. As far as optimism goes, yes, I think we need to be optimistic. There's a lot of continuous learning going on in agriculture, a lot of innovation. You know, we've gotten this far. We've had, for example, something's been going on for years. It's called the Ontario Agricultural Conference. And they would have this presented in Ridgetown, also at Kemptville, sort of Eastern Ontario, Western Ontario. And then with the pandemic, well, we weren't getting together for conferences anymore. Well, okay, that was fine. They went virtual. And then with going virtual, they could put on a lot more presentations than you could put on live. So now conferences are back, Ridgetown, Guelph, and Kemptville. But there's actually 66 now of recorded lectures on various topics, mostly from researchers and also some farmers, early adopters, and so on, available online. Not everybody can go to a conference, but it was a good a good outcome, I think, from the pandemic, that the whole thing really expanded. So now hundreds and hundreds of farmers can pick from 66 different lectures on various topics until the last day of March, and then it goes offline. So I think we need to be optimistic about the amount of research and innovation that's going on.
Add a quick comment about that in terms of optimism. The last question I was supposed to look at was what should the consumer be doing to help in this situation or educate themselves? Well, I wanted to show you this book. It's called The Real Dirt on Farming. I think there are enough copies there at the back for everybody to pick up a copy if you would like. This is the 2023-24 edition, so it's very up to date on a lot of the changes and what's happening to farming families. Well worth a read, but also I went to look at what corporations are doing in this area. They're often criticized. So I looked at the McDonald's website to see what they're doing in terms of sustainable agriculture. And for the last 10 years, they've been working with their supply chain, and they have a very detailed protocol of what suppliers to McDonald's must do, and they are audited once a year, most of them right down to the farm. And if they're not meeting the protocol, they don't supply McDonald's anymore. And John reminded me, you see the McDonald's truck going by and they say, we use Canadian beef. And yes, indeed they do, but there is quite a strict protocol with lots of sustainability aspects built into it. I'll just leave it there. Just go and look at the McDonald's website sometime and see what they're doing. It's quite remarkable.
That's interesting. Wouldn't have expected that they would have audited so carefully. I did want to just open the floor to questions because there may be some, and I'll give you guys my mic just if you want to come up. Robin, you want to come up first?
Questions. One is just what has happened in the regulatory framework that meant that 50 to 100 years ago, the county produced so much fruit and sustained, several canneries? How is that the past and not the present? And then secondly, Prince Edward County is one of the driest parts of Ontario, and the recent weather would suggest that might get worse. Do you see water availability being a limitation on agriculture in the county?
Okay, my understanding of the disappearance of the canning companies is that they were bought out by big companies, and they moved the production to southwestern Ontario to consolidate things more, to have larger acreages of really consistent, good land. It started here first, but just wasn't as competitive in some ways, and maybe they wanted to bring in more imports. I don't know the total history of that. So the other question was about yields going forward, that kind of thing, with water shortage and so on. Well, water is important, but certainly with the plant breeding, varieties are being made to be more tolerant. I did see some interesting history on that kind of thing, on the weather, specifically the weather, but also the water. There's a farmer in Ormstown, Quebec, which is a similar climate to us. Maybe it's a little farther north, maybe a little cooler, maybe a little shorter season, but it's just in the south of Montreal, as far as south and maybe southwest. And he had really detailed records. And he put down the average temperatures by decade since 1965. And it's been trending up. We know every year, a little up, a little down. How is it? Whatever. Is it warmer, cooler? But it's trended up every decade. He's only has 7 years in his last report, but the increase is 1.5 degrees, which is very similar to the world increase. And this winter, the precipitation he's measured is pretty well normal, more rain and less snow. The interesting thing too is the yields, what's happened in the yields here in the past. And he said 1965, corn yield, a decent good average corn yield in his part where he is at Ormstown was 70 bushels the acre. And now it's 170. Do the math on that, exponential math. The yields of corn have been increasing 1.5% a year. The temperature's been increasing 1.5% a year. So, and moisture's been fairly steady so far. So the climate change has not really hurt us to this point. Of course, that could change in the future because farther south, where they get more heat, more degrees, 32 degrees temperatures in the daytime is pretty hard on the corn crop. They've had some yield decreases because of that. And if it gets drier, especially as you get farther south in the States, they may have to move more away from corn into sorghum, which is more drought tolerant and also less productive. So as this trend continues, the damage may be coming here, but I don't think it has yet. We're still trending upwards on most crops, maybe all crops.
A question, John. As a crop specialist, is there any in the future, do you ever see that we could get away from commercial fertilizer? In other words, could we develop plow down crops or cover crops that could take the place of fertilizer, commercial fertilizer? Or is that always going to be a problem?
Plow down legume crops can produce nitrogen, like alfalfa and clover is a plow down crop, can produce nitrogen for the following crop. But you're taking them out of production to do it, if you do a total plow down, of course. Growing legumes for cattle, feed the cattle will, give almost enough nitrogen for the corn the next year. When we had the dairy herd, we would terminate an alfalfa field when it was 4 years old, and we'd rotate through that. And then we put on some cattle manure and no more nitrogen fertilizer needed, other than we put on a little bit of starter fertilizer, maybe along with the phosphorus and potash. Phosphorus and potash minerals, for example, can't be produced. So there's still a need for replacing those nutrients. You can't just get them. Soil health helps for a plant to obtain the phosphorus in the soil, but it's still working its way down unless it is replaced. I was reading recently a report it was a Western farm where they were trying to do it totally without buying any fertilizer, and it worked for a little while, for a few years, but the phosphorus level in that soil was going down, 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 and there's no way that they could bring it up without buying some chicken manure, which there was none in the area, or some hog manure, there was none there. They couldn't buy it. There was no, and it's not really a solution to buy it, it's to get what you need, because it's coming from some other soil somewhere that didn't get it because you just bought it. That's a shortage. So this problem in the system or the issue in the system, we can replace a lot of that. If it passes through cattle, we can replace a lot of the phosphorus and potash, for example. But a lot of it goes out in the food for humans, goes through the sewage plants, and that's not being efficiently put back on fields. Most of it doesn't come back. So I think long term, over the next decade sometime, more of that municipal sewage has to be put back on farmland, and that will reduce the amount that has to be mined. And the most feasible way for that to be handled is with dried pellets. And I guess there is some dried biosolids pellets available in Toronto, but most of that's not happening. There are concerns about it, like it's good for the nutrients to get back, but there are concerns about it. What about pharmaceuticals and products, whatever's in it? And that runs into regulations. If somebody who wants to meet my organic regulations, they're not allowed to use biosolids. If you're growing soybeans for a food grade market to Japan, like we are, you're not even allowed to use biosolids. We don't want to. We have chicken here. We don't need it. But there's just a lot of restrictions there, even though nutrients are there that should be reused.
They remove miles and miles of fence lines, fence posts. Is that absolutely necessary that we have to make fields that huge? But isn't there an erosion problem with that?
Well, there could be an erosion problem because they are more open to wind, and it's kind of a value judgment. How big do they have to be? It's more efficient for the larger equipment, but how large do they really need to be is a kind of a value judgment. I think there's some bigger than there needs to be. with minimum tillage and cover crops and, not turning the ground upside down for winter, that kind of thing, you can prevent erosion. But it'll still be windy though.
How about now? Do you remember me? John Ambrose, sustainable and affordable housing. Okay, so that's the dream of the engineer. Imagine transporting that into the world of farming that you were talking about. I mean, I haven't done the numbers yet, but I would envision chickens and cows being kept warm using geothermal with a little bit of solar and avoiding the creation of carbon dioxide. And I could also imagine the situation of using in a 12-month per year gardening situation, using the concept of kind of hydroponics, but using geothermal and solar in an enclosed building. The kind of buildings you have on the farm, I don't know the character of them, but I'm pretty sure we could design a combination of geothermal, for example, wells, and solar power to provide the small amount of electricity required for the heating of the buildings. And I could imagine, but I'm just an engineer, I'm not a farmer, but I could imagine a 12-month-a-year cycle to grow vegetables and to keep the little chickens and cows warm. But it's just an idea. I'd be pleased to work with you on that.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think I'm a good one to speak to that because we have chicks that we heat the barn up to like 92 degrees. I also have ground source heat pump in the basement of our house, been heating the house since 2008. We certainly can't get 100-degree air out of the ductwork. We're glad to have it. We're heating the house, it's fine. But it's not the hot heat. And we need hot heat. We also have a lot of solar panels on the farm too. But that's another story. That was a kind of a financial sustainability project for the farm because there was money to be made in the microgrid before the government's canceled it. And I hope there's still some sale for that power when the contract runs out. But anyway, there's also a certain amount of dust and so on. If you're trying to circulate air in a barn, you may not even see the dust, but yes, you've got straw there and you've got chickens moving around and so on. So if you put a filter there and start passing air through it, then you'll soon realize that, yeah, there is dust in that air and not enough temperature. And I have thought of it, but somebody would have to give us a lot of money to make an effort to feasible.
I might, oh.
That's true.
One tractor, left, okay. When they got a second one, she said, when is this tractor madness going to stop?
You speak, you speak very highly of supply chain management. I'm really curious what we learned from the dissolution of the wheat board recently. And I'm curious as to whether you see supply chain management having potential to extend into other sectors or not.
So you're thinking of the marketing board, a situation that we have, would it apply to other commodities? Well, the chicken, egg, and dairy sectors are primarily geared to domestic consumption, I would say, and that's why it works so well with those particular commodities. With the other grain, for instance, grain crops, great deal of export. In this book, let me see, it had the statistics for the exports of various Canadian crops. I'm not sure it would work so well there. In fact, I doubt it would. Is that enough of an answer? Or do you need more detail on why it wouldn't? You want to?
Well, you can't have a supply management when you're in an export business.
Yeah, it depends on import controls to keep it going.
A lot of the environmental and sustainability problems that agriculture is producing are a result of our use of fossil fuels. And those result from after about 1910, when most people work in agriculture, that percentage decreased to what, about 1.5% or less that is now. My question is, in a longer terms, do you see a return to small farms, to really small farms like they used to be, or small family farms?
No. But I say no, not because I don't think that there will be an emergence of more small scale farms. I'm saying no to, I don't think it's going to go back to the way it was at that point in time. There's a significant increase in technology adoption that is just not going to allow us to go back to what it once was. But I do think that we can see a bit of an ebb and flow around the scalability of certain types of agricultural commodities. One of the things that has been really interesting in conversation lately is permitting solar panels on farmland. And there was an article in BBC, CTV, something, one of the news outlets, where a gentleman was basically saying that our regulations are preventing us from being able to adopt better, greener technology. And so we need to get rid of these types of regulations in order to permit this. However, what he failed to address was that we don't have the regulations in place that's going to allow us to continue to protect the amount of farmland that we need to. And why I think that we won't go back, and why I'm using the solar panel as an example, is because we're going to see these types of technologies have new regulations put in place that's going to permit these types of things to be infused into our agricultural systems. I think solar panels is one example, but there's a lot going on with precision agriculture that was mentioned earlier as well that's really going to change how we are going to be producing crops. And I think that with this type of changing technology, the cost associated with being able to buy and adopt this technology isn't going to really allow us to have an agricultural system that takes us back to a time where that family farm size, that smaller scale agriculture is the norm. But I do think that it's really important that we continue to nurture and protect and allow to grow an emergence of the small agriculture again. It takes a whole range of agriculture to be able to do what we do in this province in terms of food production. And it's going to take the large scale, and it's going to take the small scale, and it's going to take what we've been talking a lot more about at the Farmland Trust is the missing middle. The missing middle in agriculture is also something that I don't think is being talked about enough as well. And so I want to say yes, but I don't think we're going to get quite to that point, but we'll see an emergence again on some scale, particularly also when I think we're seeing a lot more adoption of urban agriculture, where you tend to see more of that small scale farms. But that won't look like what it did in 1910.
Could I make a comment on that as well? In terms of farm labor, you mentioned possibly the idea that we can bring immigrants in to fill in the farm labor situation, but with technology advancing the way it is, to have help on your farm, you need somebody who's very technological literate is what I'm trying to say. It's not just anybody who can be a farm hand anymore, and the more technologically literate they are, the more valuable, really, in terms of operating your, even your combine, your robotic milking stall. There's a lot to learn.
My question is for Martin. How is farmland protection doing in our county?
That's a loaded question, Howard. Well, the Farmland Trust is extremely busy in Prince Edward County, particularly over the last couple of years, which I think is a really positive sign about how the community has recognized the increasing pressures of development that is being seen here. To one of the questions earlier about water, I think we were able to answer this perspective of crops using water, but if we see an increase of housing coming to the county, that's going to put a whole other level of pressure on whether or not we have water availability, not just for our crops if there's going to be irrigation, or but for our housing and residents as well. And so what's great to see is that there is this really substantial increase in interest in how private landowners can engage in farmland protection. And working with an organization like the Ontario Farmland Trust, we are able to facilitate that type of agency that landowners have to be able to protect their properties. One of the things that I think is an area for improvement in the county is the adoption of land use planning policies and how land is being designated between prime agricultural land and rural land. Rural land has a lot more permissions for other non-agricultural uses, which is important in an agricultural system. But at the same time, if you're designating prime agricultural land as rural, it's a lot more likely that that's going to be removed. And at the same time, allowing, I think, quite a substantial amount of housing developments in areas that, again, were founded on agricultural communities, right? And so if a product of the county's success is their agricultural sector, and people really love the charm of the county and then want to move out here, but then this whole influx of people, particularly we saw with the pandemic, is creating these additional pressures for development that's going to undermine the entire thing that attracted them to the county in the first place. And so I think we need some responsible land use planning policies in place so that those folks who do have an interest in coming out here, which I think is important for economic development as well, but if they want to move out here, those people who are moving here should be doing so in a way that they're ensuring there's responsible development happening so that they weren't contributing to urban sprawl type development in the county. So it's complex, but it's really, we were talking about whether we feel hope for the future. I can't remember exactly what the question was, but when I get to work with landowners in Prince Edward County, I'm very inspired by how passionate and dedicated the folks are in this region to be able to say, the agricultural land is a part of what makes us special, and we want to make sure we protect it. So.
I forgot I stole your microphone.
I just want to thank you so much for your time today. This is amazing. So many good points were made, and I've learned so much, even so fascinating, really, to just think about how farming has evolved and what might be coming forward for us. And I will, if you guys have any more questions, you try to catch John, Jane, and Martin just as we mill about, but we'll end the recording here now. And thank you so much.
Possible to, okay, I'm just gonna make one quick plug. The Ontario Farmland Trust every year hosts our annual Farmland Forum. And to John's earlier comment, because of the pandemic, we were forced to figure out how to go hybrid. If you're able to make it in person, it's March 21st down in Elora, but it's also available online. So if you visit the Ontario Farmland Trust website, ontariofarmlandtrust.ca, and you can find more information on the forum. Also just note that the early bird ticket prices finish this week, so get your tickets now.